Day 3. Jake and Steve sat at the table and talked until roughly 7 a.m., and Jake said, "We should get ready to go. We should check out the end of the house and then walk onto the car and head into town." "What if that thing tries to attack us on our way to the car?" Steve asked as he shrunk back in his chair. "I've been thinking about that too," Jake said as he glanced left. "The only weapons we have are a few kitchen knives in here and an axe and hatchet out in the tool shed. We should take the axe and hatchet with us when we walk to the car." "I guess that's better than nothing," Steve said as he rolled his eyes. "Meet me at the end of the house," Jake said as he got dressed. "I'll come back and lock the door before we leave." Jake lit a cigarette and walked out the door and stepped off the porch. As soon as he stepped into the yard, he noticed extremely large areas of flattened grass which led from the front gate and across the yard and toward the end of the house. These areas were much larger than the ones they saw the day before yesterday. Jake wondered if there was more than one of these things messing with them. Judging from the different sized footprints, Jake knew this as fact. He followed the footprints to the end of the house and noticed an extra large area of flattened grass beside where he thought the loud bang came from. The area looked like it was where the thing paced last night. He also noticed the oak branch he threw into the weeds on the hillside now lay just under the edge of the house. This end of the house sat on pillars made from stacked river rocks. The floor of the house sat approximately 1.5 feet off the surface of the ground. That provided enough room for something to crawl underneath the house and hide. Jake didn't suspect the thing they heard last night was underneath the house because it sounded like it was too big to fit under it. Jake pulled the oak branch from under the house and noticed it was snapped in half toward its upper end. He looked around to see if he could find the broken piece but couldn't locate it anywhere. While he examined the oak branch, he noticed the barnyard gate stood open. He assumed he was correct when he heard something open the gate last night. The gate hinges squeak and the wrought iron latch made a metal-on-metal noise when it moved. When Jake examined the outside of the house, he noticed a large dent in the sidewall almost exactly centered between his and Steve's bedroom windows. The dent was 8 feet off the ground. It completely penetrated the brittle asphalt siding and broke away another 2 by 3 foot section of it. Large and small bits of siding lay on the ground underneath the dent. The house appeared to have been struck with such force the middle clapboard underneath where the siding had fallen off was dented and a large hole formed at the center of impact. On closer examination, it looked like a large knot of wood was forced out of the clapboard where the oak branch struck the house. Jake scanned the ground but couldn't find the knot. He assumed the wood knot might have been pushed completely through the clapboard. He made a mental note to himself to check the wall inside Steve's bedroom. Steve joined Jake a few minutes later and surveyed the damage. While Jake glanced at Steve, he asked, "Did you see the new set of footprints leading over here from the front gate?" "I sure did," Steve said as he looked at the siding. "I followed them around here to the side of the house." Steve turned around and looked beyond Jake to the barnyard gate. "The gate's open again." Jake said, "I noticed that and knew it sounded like whatever messed with us last night opened the gate and left." Steve asked as he glanced at the gate, "Did you notice anything peculiar?" "No." "Why?" Steve backed up to where he could see the front gate. "Why would these things come into the yard and open and close the front gate but leave the barnyard gate open?" "You're right," Jake said. "I didn't notice the front gate was closed." "Good catch. I don't understand it either. It looks like this thing knows how to work the latch on the gate. I think it's odd that if it entered through the front gate, why it didn't open the gate to enter like it opens the barnyard gate to exit. Maybe we're dealing with 2 different creatures. Maybe the larger of the 2 stepped or jumped over the fence." Steve's eyes widened, his face paled, he hunched his shoulders and rocked from side to side. Jake re-explained his theory and said, "Maybe the one that opened the gate also figured out how to close it. Maybe the creature opened and closed the front gate but just forgot to close the barnyard gate when it left." Jake's explanation did little to relieve Steve. He sighed as he glanced at the broken bedroom window. "We'd better get going if we want to get back and get that window fixed before nightfall." Jake turned and quickly scanned the barnyard and said, "Yeah, I don't want to be out here fixing the window in the dark." On their way, Jake stopped and locked the front door and picked up the empty cooler. He stopped and unlocked the tool shed and got the axe and hatchet. Since he carried the cooler, he offered the axe to Steve. Steve grasped the axe by its handle and laid the head of it over his right shoulder. They made their way down the road to the car. They were both nervous and kept their eyes and ears open and paid careful attention to the moderately wooded tree line which enveloped both sides of the road. The tree line on the left side of the road, which overlooked the bottom and the property around the retreat, was not as densely wooded as the right side of the road, which bordered the river. The walk to the car was uneventful. They loaded the cooler and weapons into the trunk and got into the car and headed to town. When they reached the hard road, Jake said, "It'll take about 35 minutes to get there." Steve turned the radio on and searched for a music station. Jake slowed down when they approached Walkersville so he could point out the old grist mill he mentioned yesterday. He also pointed out the church where his mom and dad were married. Jake turned the radio down. The trip from the farm to the grist mill seemed 10 times longer when I made it in a horse and wagon. "I suppose it would," Steve said as he turned the volume back up. They continued on and arrived at the Murphy 5 and dime store located in the center of town on Market Street. It was really the only department store in all of Weston. Jake stocked up on 4-packs of D-cell batteries. He figured that would be enough to last until they left at the end of the following week. Although, he realized they might have to leave sooner if whoever messed with them didn't leave them alone. At this point, Jake wasn't convinced if what they dealt with was man or beast. Steve found Jake in the hardware aisle as he put the batteries into a shopping basket. He asked, "Can I put my munchies in your basket?" Jake handed the basket to Steve. "Yeah, as long as you carry it. Are you going to watch how much toilet paper you use, or am I going to have to buy more?" "I'll watch because I don't want to have to wipe my ass with the corn cobs." Jake chuckled. They made their way to the checkout and Jake asked the clerk, "I need to get a pane of glass to fix a broken window. Where's the nearest hardware store located?" The clerk winked at Jake. "Make a right out of the parking lot and go about 4 blocks. Make a left on 5th Street and the hardware store will be about a quarter mile down on the left. They'll have to order the glass for you because they don't keep it in stock." The clerk over there'll take the measurements and order the pane. It usually takes up to a week before the glass come in. Jake paid her and thanked her for her time. Before he left, he asked, "How do you know so much about the hardware store?" "I used to work there," she said as she winked at Jake again. Jake leaned over the counter and whispered, "Can I get ice at the local gas station?" "Yeah," she whispered as she flipped her hair. "But it'll be more expensive at the gas station than it'll be at the grocery store." While they walked toward the door, Jake looked back and said, "I'd rather get it at the gas station instead of making an extra stop." She chuckled and flipped her hair again. "Y'all have a nice day now. And don't forget to come back soon." They made their way out the door and Steve loaded the batteries and his munchies into the trunk and got in the car. Jake got into the car and said, "Since it'll take a week to get the glass, I'm gonna skip it for the time being. I'll just board the window up when we get back to the farm. I'd rather order a piece of glass at home and install it the next time we visit." "It'll probably be easier that way," Steve said. "Did you notice how that clerk kept flirting with you?" "Yeah, I noticed. She's really not my type." "She looked hot to me," Steve said. His eyebrows waggled. "I saw her name on her name tag. Her name's Heather. You want me to take you back there so you can flirt and talk with Heather?" Jake said as he pulled out of the parking lot headed back in the direction from which they came. "Nah, I've got Valerie at home." "Good boy." Like an idiot, Jake thought, I didn't even need to ask Heather at the 5 and dime if I could get ice at the gas station because there's a sign out by the road at the mom and pop store which says they sell ice there. Jake pulled into the station and parked in front of the pump, turned off the ignition and got out of the car. He filled the car up with fuel and when he finished, he walked inside to pay the clerk and pick up the ice. The clerk took his money for the fuel and then charged him another $9 for 3 10-pound bags of ice. The clerk at the 5 and dime store wasn't kidding about it costing more here than at the grocery store. Jake thought, this is highway robbery. He handed the clerk a $10 bill and told him to keep the change. He said, "You can get the ice from the machine outside." Jake picked up the ice on his way back to the car where Steve waited with both the trunk and lid of the cooler open. He tossed the ice into the cooler and Steve closed the cooler and the trunk lid. They both got back into the car. Steve popped a cassette into the car stereo, cranked up the volume, and they sang a couple renditions of Huey Lewis and the new songs Do You Believe in Love and The Heart of Rock and Roll on their way back to Wildcat. They each took turns singing lead and backup to practice for their band back home. It was roughly 35 minutes later when Jake pulled back into his parking spot alongside the swinging bridge. Steve ejected the cassette tape and turned off the radio and popped the lid of the trunk when he hit a button inside the glove box. He got out and closed his door and walked to the back of the car. Jake got out and hit the button on the driver door to lock the passenger area of the car. He closed his door and walked to the back of the car and said, "Put everything in the cooler and we'll each carry it by one handle while we carry the axe and hatchet in the other hand." "That's a good idea. Why didn't I think of that?" Steve said as he rolled his eyes. Jake closed the trunk lid and picked up one end of the cooler, and they set out across the bridge. It was tough going because the bridge bounced and swayed hard. Each of them had both hands full, so they couldn't hold onto the steel cables while they crossed. About a quarter of the way across the bridge, Jake said, "Hold on a minute. We should open the cooler and drop the weapons inside until we get across the bridge." Because Steve had turned 3 shades of green, he agreed readily. They made it to the other side and down the steps to the path. They stopped and set the cooler down so they could get the weapons back out of it. Jake said, "I'll carry the axe this time." Steve gagged and said, "The bigger the weapon, the bigger the man." Jake nodded and smiled. "Are you going to be okay?" "Yeah, that damn bridge nearly made me seasick." Jake laughed. They continued on and kept their eyes and ears open while they made their half-mile trek to the house. They made it in record time. When they stepped onto the porch, they noticed everything was the way they left it and placed the axe and the hatchet on the concrete porch floor just outside the front door. Jake retrieved his keys from his pocket and unlocked the door. Steve said, "I need to go take a leak. I'll be right back." Jake rolled his eyes and in a taut voice said, "Don't worry, I can carry the cooler into the house by myself." Steve took off as Jake pushed the front door open with his left foot and stepped into the kitchen. He sat the cooler down on the kitchen table and took the batteries and munchies out of it and laid them beside the cooler. He took 2 bags of ice and dropped them on the floor and beat them around a few times to break it up before he put it in the other cooler with the food. When he finished, he broke the other bag up but left the ice inside the bag to use for ice cubes. He dropped the bag of ice into the empty cooler along with several bottles of water and the remaining cans of soda. Steve came back inside the moment Jake dropped the last soda can into the cooler. "Guess what?" "What?" Jake said as he spun around to look at Steve. "The barnyard gate's standing open again." "Humph, that doesn't surprise me." Steve said, "It seems something comes and goes through the yard when we are either away from the house or while we're inside at night. Not to mention it's smart if it can open the gate latch." "I don't think an animal could open the latch. I've been thinking about it, and I think we're dealing with a human. I'm about ready to go and get one of Grandpa's old bear traps and set it outside the barnyard gate to see exactly what we're dealing with at this point." Steve chuckled and said, "Yeah, but what happens when one of us forgets it's there and steps into it?" "I didn't think of that," Jake said. "It might not be such a good idea, especially if we go out there after dark. Go get both flashlights so we can put the batteries in them and make sure they're gonna work." "All right," Steve said as he turned to walk to Jake's bedroom. Steve came back a few seconds later and they installed the batteries and both flashlights worked as they should. They set the flashlights aside on the kitchen table and Jake said, "I'm going out to the porch to smoke." Steve followed Jake outside while he ate one of his newly purchased peanut butter and chocolate wafer bars. "Do you want to get a campfire started again tonight?" "Why not?" Jake said. "I want to save the leftover fish from last night for lunch tomorrow. How about we eat a hamburger and fried potatoes for dinner tonight?" "That sounds good," Steve said as he finished his snack and threw the wrapper on the ground. Jake's eyes narrowed and his jaw dropped as he glared at Steve. "Are you gonna pick that up?" Yeah, sorry. Your mama ain't here to pick up after you, and I'm not gonna do it. I just wasn't thinking, Dot. After I finish my smoke, we should go get more firewood and haul it out to the barnyard," Steve said. "I'll go ahead and get started," as he walked toward the front gate. Steve walked to the woodpile while Jake sat on the bench to finish his cigarette. He watched Steve carry the first load of firewood by, and on his return trip he joined him. Together, they made a total of 4 round trips. Each of them carried 4 large armfuls of firewood. Jake said, "We should pile the wood up into 2 piles on either side of the campfire ring," as he deposited his 4th load of wood onto his growing pile. "Like we did last night?" Steve asked. "Yeah. So we have a pile to sit on and one to burn. What would you like to do to kill some time?" Jake asked after he looked at his watch and learned they had a few hours to kill before dinner. "I want to explore the outbuildings in the barnyard," Steve said as he stacked the remaining pieces of firewood into his pile. "Which building do you want to start in?" Jake asked and said, "We haven't looked at the cornhouse, the chicken coop, the pig pen, or the barn yet." "The barn." After Steve finished stacking his piles of firewood, they walked to the barn. Jake had his key in hand to unlock the door by the time they got there. He opened the center section of the barn first. When he opened the door, a strong, musty odor poured out. It was the smell of old rotting straw which had been left in the barn along with a tinge of something else he couldn't quite put his finger on. As their eyes grew accustomed to the dim light inside, they could see the sun shine between the spaces of the tall boards on the back wall of the barn. The ribbons of light shimmered between the boards and cast eerie shadows all throughout this part of the barn. Hanging on a nail on the right just inside the doorway was Barney's old saddle along with other tack Jake's grandpa had used when he worked Barney. To the left of the saddle was a rectangular opening, which provided access to the horse stalls next door. Jake or his grandpa would gather straw and throw it through the opening into a trough on the other side of the wall to feed the horses. About 30 feet away on the same wall, toward the back of the barn, was a duplicate opening to feed the cows in the same manner. While they looked around, there really wasn't anything else in this part of the barn with the exception of a few bales of hay toward the back wall and a small stack of wooden boards which sat against the front wall to the left of the doorway. Steve pointed to the overhead loft. "What's up there?" "Nothing I know of. It's just another storage area for hay." They stepped back into the barnyard and Jake closed and locked the barn door. Steve said, "I want to see the cow stables. Come on." They walked around to the back of the barn and noticed a large section on the end of the barn near the cow stables had been smashed through. The hole was near the ground and measured 3 feet long by 2 feet high. It looked as though something had kicked the wood away and threw the splintered pieces of the boards into a pile outside the barn. It was obvious the boards were not cut because they were splintered. Upon closer examination of the broken boards on the barn wall, the edges of the boards appeared worn. It looked like someone or something had climbed in and out through the hole for quite some time in order to make the edges of the boards as worn and smooth as they were. Steve asked, "Has this always been this way?" "No," Jake said as he stood and scanned the tree line behind the barn. "Come on. We'll continue on around to the back and I'll open the stable doors." Jake unlocked and opened the stable door. They both backstepped when Jake opened the door. A strong odor came from inside the cow stable and was far worse than the odor they smelled in the other side of the barn. This new odor smelled like old rotten straw, but was mixed with a pungent wild animal, sent along with a tinge of what Jake thought smelled like sulfur. "For as overwhelming as the odor is now since I opened the door, I wonder why we didn't smell it while we examined the hole in the side of the barn?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Steve shrugged. "Maybe the open door is letting more of the stink out." "You might be right." When they walked inside, they could make out what Jake could only describe as a nest in the second cow stall nearest the center section of the barn against the inside wall. The nest was comprised of old pine branches with straw scattered loosely over the tops of them. The nest was nearly 1.5 feet thick and about 5 feet wide by 8 feet long. It was huge. It looked like it hadn't been used for a while. They decided they didn't want to stay there any longer than they needed to. They walked back outside and Jake closed and locked the door. Steve laughed and said, "I don't know what good the lock will do to keep anyone out of there since they could crawl through the hole in the side of the barn." Jake shrugged and nodded as he put the padlock back through the hasp and locked it. Steve said, "How about if we check out the chicken coop next?" "There really isn't anything exciting in it," Jake said as he explained the layout of the coop. Jake led Steve to the pig pen. The pig pen was never locked. The shutter over the front opening and the door on the right side of the stable opened outward. They each had a small wooden board, approximately 1 inch thick by 3 inches wide and 6 inches long, attached to the building by a nail through their center. They were located near each opening. The small wooden boards overlapped the shutter and the side door of the stable to hold them closed. To open either of them, you had to twist one end of the board until it cleared the opening. This was the same mechanism on the outhouse door, except there was a board on either side. This was to hold the door closed from the inside when it was occupied. They walked up to the front of the pig pen and Steve twisted the board to free the shutter. As he raised and hooked it open, the first thing Jake noticed was the side door of the stable had been completely ripped from its hinges. It lay about 5 feet from its opening inside the pen. In addition, they both saw another nest like the one they just discovered in the cow stable. The only difference between the one they found earlier and this one was recently built. It was built from newer pine branches because they were still green, and there wasn't any straw scattered over the tops of them. The wild animal and sulfur smells were a lot stronger in the pig pen than they were in the barn. Steve unhooked the shutter and clasped it shut and said, "We need to go." They quickly made their way back to the house. It approached 6 p.m. and was time to get dinner started. Jake got the hamburger from the cooler and mixed it up with various spices and pressed the meat into patties. He arranged 4 hamburger patties on a plate and set them aside. He sliced several medium-sized potatoes into quarter-inch thick slices and put them in a bowl of water with a little salt to keep them from turning brown. Jake asked, "Will you go get the propane stove set up and going while I finish up in the kitchen?" Steve set the stove back up on the table on the front porch. "Why are you going to cook on the stove instead of over the campfire?" "It's getting late, and by the time we get the campfire going and everything hauled out there to it, it'll be too much trouble. I just decided to do it here instead because it'll be faster." "Yeah, you're probably right," Steve said as he sat down on the porch swing. Jake said, "After dinner, we can get the campfire going and sit near it and relax." After they ate and put everything away, they made their way out to the barnyard to get the campfire started. It was already dark, so they each carried a lit flashlight, an unlit lantern, and Jake carried the axe while Steve carried the hatchet. When they walked around the corner of the house, Steve shined his flashlight on the barnyard gate, and they noticed it remained closed. Jake unlatched it, and they walked through it into the barnyard. Steve closed and latched it behind them. When they arrived at the campfire ring, they noticed the firewood remained stacked into the piles they made earlier. They sat their lanterns on the ground near their wood piles, and Jake asked, "Will you shine your flashlight toward my wood pile so I can pick up several pieces of firewood and kindling to put in the fire ring to get the fire started?" The fire started easier tonight than it did last night, and within a few minutes they had a decent-sized campfire burning. Steve sat on his pile of firewood with his face to the fire and his back to the barn. Jake sat directly across from Steve with his back to the house. They sat and talked while they tried to keep their eyes adjusted to the shadows beyond where the firelight reached. Every once in a while, they would hear a distant twig snap or hear small rocks clank together in the woods behind the barn. Jake said, "It's probably just deer foraging through the woods looking for something to eat," as he looked toward the tree line behind the barn. Steve looked nervously in the direction of the noise. "That's probably all it is." Jake said, "Don't worry, I doubt we'll get any visitors tonight because none of the events from yesterday or last night have repeated except for finding the barnyard gate open this morning. At least the firewood remains stacked and hasn't been scattered like it was last night. Maybe whoever is messing with us got tired when they realized we don't scare too easily." Steve said, "Speak for yourself. I'm a little scared. Based on what we discovered today and what we saw and heard yesterday, I'm not convinced we're dealing with something human. What about the nest we found in the barn and the pig pen? What about the huge footprints? What about the heavy breathing we heard outside the bedroom windows last night? After all the strange shit we've discovered and witnessed, do you still think what's messing with us is human?" "Whoa, slow down. You make a good point," Jake said as he held his right hand up to face Steve. Jake doubted his own interpretation of all the evidence and the events they discovered. They continued to sit near the fire and talk. Steve said, "You forgot to board up your bedroom window. Since it's getting late and I didn't bring my keys with me to unlock the barn, I'll just wait and board it up tomorrow." "Where are your keys?" "I spilled some ketchup on my jeans and changed them before dinner. I left my keys on the dresser in my bedroom." Getting back to what we talked about earlier, I think the heavy chest of drawers we placed in front of the window will keep any would-be critters out. I just hope you're right. Steve had no sooner uttered those words when an extremely loud, blood-curdling scream came from several hundred yards away on the mountainside above them. Steve jumped up from his pile of logs and nearly fell into the campfire as he tripped over his own feet, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that? What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Jake said. "I've never heard anything like it before." "Calm down. It's a good distance away." "The scream could have been a coyote howl," Steve said as he looked in the direction the scream came from. "I don't think so. The screamer sounds like it's way too big to be a coyote." A few seconds after the scream, a loud distinct wood knock came from the tree line behind the barn. Jake jumped to his feet this time, and within another couple seconds, they distinctly heard another loud knock come from the other side of the house near the car gate. They knew there were 3 distinct beings they were dealing with. Jake said they must communicate back and forth with the wood knocks as he looked toward the house. "It sure seems that way," Steve said as he looked over his shoulder. "Grab your stuff and we'll head back to the house. We can let the campfire burn out like we did last night," Jake said while he picked up the flashlight, lantern, and axe. They both turned their flashlights on to illuminate their path back to the house. Just before they made it to the porch, the thing on the mountainside let out another wretched scream. It sounded closer this time. Jake shined his light and looked toward the direction of the car gate to see if he could identify the wood knocker, but didn't see anything. Jake said, "Go on in the house and take my lantern and flashlight with you. Get both lanterns going and set one in the living room on top of the old coal stove and the other in the kitchen on the table. The lanterns will illuminate the two main rooms of the house, and we won't have to stumble around in the dark. We can leave them burn all night because there's plenty of kerosene in the tool shed. I found another full 5-gallon can of it when I got the axe and hatchet earlier this morning. I want to sit on the porch and smoke another cigarette before I come inside. I'll get everything set up," Steve said as he stepped into the house. Within a couple minutes, a warm glow emanated from the kitchen and living room windows. While Jake sat and smoked on the front porch, he heard 2 more tree knocks come from opposite ends of the property. Steve joined Jake back out on the porch. Jake said, "Even though the house is stuffy inside, I wouldn't put the window screen in your window tonight, and double check to make sure your bedroom window is locked. It's better to be safe than sorry. The wood knocks are getting closer." Steve said, "I didn't hear them from inside the house." "I certainly heard them," Jake said. A couple more minutes passed, and they heard the wood knocks yet again, and they sounded as if they were closer still. The closest knock sounded like it came from the car lot next to the tool shed. Jake asked, "Will you go get one of the flashlights from inside and we'll point it in the direction of the tool shed to see if we can see anything?" Steve quietly stepped back inside the house and retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen table and brought it back outside. Jake said, "Aim it toward the tool shed before you turn it on." When Steve hit the button to light the flashlight, they both saw a large, hairy humanoid figure jump into the shadows between the coal house and the wash house. The figure stood well over 7 feet tall. They both wondered what they had just seen. As Steve continued to aim the light in that direction, they both heard large rocks clank together and water splash down over the riverbank near the wash house. They assumed the creature climbed down over the riverbank and took off. They continued to watch for several more minutes while Steve shined the light from the wash house to the front gate to see if the creature would reappear. They didn't see it anymore, but they did hear another tree knock come from across the river. Jake said, "It must have retreated back into the woods on the other side of the river." A return knock came within a few seconds, and it too sounded like it was farther away. It might have come from the other side of the barn. They continued to sit on the front porch in the dark for about another hour. They didn't hear anything else come from the woods. Jake's watch told him it was time to go to bed. He said, "It's nearly midnight and I'm gonna go get ready for bed. I suggest you do the same." Steve was a little hesitant and asked, "What if they come back?" Jake said, "The house should be pretty secure. I'll lock the front door and make sure all of the windows are locked." Steve asked, "Can I sleep in the other bed in your room?" "That'll be okay. Just bring your flashlight with you so we'll each have one if something happens overnight." Jake picked up the axe and hatchet and carried them into his bedroom. Steve brought the pillow, sheets, and blanket from his room to make up the spare bed in Jake's room. After Steve got his bed made, they both settled in for the night. The light from the lantern in the living room was dim but provided enough illumination to see dark outlines of the furniture and other objects inside the bedroom. Jake preferred complete darkness when he slept, so he turned his back to the living room and faced the chest of drawers and quickly fell asleep. Jake woke up around 3 a.m. because he had to pee very badly. Not knowing what awaited him should he venture outside, he decided to drag the chamber pot from underneath the bed and do his business in it. Steve snored loudly in the other bed. Jake guessed he wasn't too worried about anything which might happen or go bump in the night. Jake finished his business and put the lid back on the chamber pot and slid it back underneath the bed. Jake climbed back into bed and again faced the chest of drawers. He had just gotten settled in and began to drift back off to sleep. He heard a slight creaky sound and opened his eyes. He noticed the chest of drawers appeared to move toward him. He thought he was asleep and dreaming. The top of the chest was suddenly driven forward, and it made a thunderous sound as it tipped over and hit the floor in the space between his bed and the window. Jake jumped out of the other side of his bed as Steve jumped out of his. They both saw two large hairy arms retreat from the broken window. They flipped their flashlights on and got dressed. They yelled to scare the creature off. It apparently worked because Jake heard it retreat away from the window and move in the direction of the front gate. A few seconds later, they heard a loud crash at the front door. Steve shouted, "It's trying to get in." Jake hurriedly looked out the bedroom window where he could see the front yard and didn't see any sign of the creature. Then Jake shined his flashlight toward the porch and saw the table and propane stove as they lay in ruin at the foot of the door. It looked as though the creature picked the table up with the stove sitting on top of it and hurled them both at the front door. The propane stove lay in pieces on the porch floor along with the shattered remains of what used to be a small wood table. Jake's eyes widened. His voice stuttered. The thing through the stove and table at the door, it's not trying to get in, at least from what I can tell. It looks like the door held fast. I can't see any light from the lantern coming from the kitchen penetrating through the door itself or coming from around the door jamb. Man, to completely destroy a metal propane stove requires great strength. Steve let out a deep breath and felt somewhat relieved knowing the door still stood solidly in its frame. Jake shined the flashlight through the window and around the front yard. He hoped to get a glimpse of the creature. He didn't see it. He turned to face Steve and said, "Maybe after it threw the table and stove against the door, it got its fill of anger and left. The front gate is still closed. I know it didn't come back around to this end of the house because we would have heard it through the broken window. Where could it have gone? Could it have walked around the other end of the house between the kitchen and cellar? Could it be standing on the hillside between the road and the back of the house? Could it have stepped over the fence? Is that how it made its getaway? Who knows where it went? I'm just happy it ain't outside anymore," Steve said, breathing heavily. "Calm down and help me set the chest back upright in front of the window. Give me a sec." Like the dresser in the living room, this chest was also full of linens, heavy blankets, and quilts. The drawers fell out of the chest when they attempted to stand it upright. Their contents spilled all over the floor. They had to pull the drawers completely out of the chest before they could stand it upright. Steve helped Jake pick up and stuff the sheets, pillowcases, and blankets back into the drawers and the drawers back into the chest. They slid the chest back into position in front of the broken window. Jake asked, "Will you help me move my bed against the chest to create a barricade so it can't be easily knocked over again?" "Yeah, come on, let's turn it around," Jake said. "After we move my bed to its new location and turn it sideways and put the foot against the chest, it'll put the side of the bed directly against the window. I know I won't be able to sleep in that bed until I board up the broken window and return it to its original position. I know if the creature breaks through the middle window while I'm asleep, it could easily grab me. I've got to make it a point to board the window up in the morning." "That'd be a good idea," Steve said. After they got everything situated and the house secured, they moved to the kitchen and took the flashlights, hatchet, and axe with them. Jake said, "Leave the lantern burn in the living room to keep that part of the house lit up until the sun comes up." Jake explained everything to Steve that had happened up until the time the chest was tipped over. He explained how after he had gotten back into bed after he took care of his business, how the chest appeared to move toward him. Steve asked, "How did the creature know where you were inside the house?" "I think it was standing outside the broken bedroom window and listening when it heard me get up to pee. It's pretty brazen for it to attack with the lights on, not knowing where we are inside the house or what we're doing," Steve said. "Since the curtains and blinds are open in the bedroom, it might have been standing at the middle window watching us sleep. Maybe it saw you get up and then get back into bed, and it walked over to the broken window to shove the chest over on you, but you had already moved out of the way of it. Maybe that's why it tried to tip it over when it did. It did it right then to kill you." "I just don't know," Jake said. "I don't know why it would wait until the exact moment I got back into bed to tip it over. It probably heard me slide the chamber pot in and out from under the bed, and that caused it to figure out where I was in the house." Steve said, "I don't think any time of day would matter to these things because it seems they're out all times of the day and night." "I have to agree with you on that one." Jake stood and walked through the house and closed all the blinds and curtains on every window. He didn't consider the fact these things could see in the dark. For that matter, he never would have dreamed these things would peek through the windows at night to begin with. He walked back into the kitchen and sat and said, The creature that came through the yard the night before could have been standing at both our bedroom windows watching us sleep before it started banging on the side of the house. Steve's paled, his eyes widened. Jake said, I consider you extremely lucky considering how close the head of your bed is in proximity to the window in the other bedroom. I can only imagine how easy it would be for one of those things to push the screen out and reach in and grab you while you were asleep. Who knows? Maybe they've been observing us and everything we've been doing since we've been here. It certainly sounds logical, Steve said as he calmed down and the color returned to his face. Jake said, all the clues over the past few days are finally adding up. The oak branch and patches of asphalt siding which were torn from the house. The dent in the end of the house. The footprints in the yard which led to the barnyard gate. The gate being left open at odd times when we know full well we shut and latched it. The rocks thrown and the patch of fur you saw retreat up the riverbank while we fished. The enormous footprint I discovered when I went back to get the cans of soda from the fishing hole. The twig snaps and branch breaks on the trail. The person we saw who walked down the road that looked like they were dressed all in black from head to toe. The broken window screen and window in my bedroom. The wood knocks. The nest we found in the cow stable and pig pen, and the screams up on the mountainside. It seems as though we have some seriously pissed off monsters that don't want us to hang around here. I agree, Steve said as he nodded. Now, what are we going to do about it? Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.